Welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. Tonight, I have the privilege of welcoming you to the first event of our celebration of the life and works of Charles Dickens. This very day, February 7th, 2012, marks the 200th year of the day of his birth. And although he is as dead as a doornail, yeah, I know, cheap shot, Dickens' stories still resonate with us today. David Copperfield, Great Expectations, Bleak House, and A Christmas Carol have lasted the test of time, finding new readers with each generation. Dickens is familiar even beyond readers. His words, names, stories have influenced our language, media, and culture. And even Google honors Dickens today with a Dickensian Google theme, and that means you've made it. So well done, Charles Dickens. Before we begin tonight's event, I wanted to quickly invite everybody to our upcoming events. On Monday, March 5th, please join us for a conversation on the novel Oliver Twist. The discussion is part of the ongoing Controversies and Conversations series hosted by the Obermann Center, Project on Rhetoric Inquiry, and Prairie Lights Bookstore. It is open to everybody, and copies of Oliver Twist will be available beginning today at Prairie Lights to the first 25 people who sign up to attend the discussion. And you have to sign, there's a sign-up sheet for that too, at Prairie Lights. That is also at 7 p.m. here in Meeting Room A on Monday, March 5th. On Friday, March 9th, we kick off our Dickens Film Festival with guest speaker Corey Creekmore, Associate Professor in the University of Iowa Departments of English and Comparative Literature and Cinema. He will discuss Dickens and film at 7 p.m. here in Meeting Room A. On the following Fridays, we will show 4 Dickens films. March 16th is David Copperfield, the 23rd is Great Expectations, the 30th is Oliver, and April 6th is Nicholas Nickleby. All films are shown at 7 p.m. right here in Meeting Room A. For more information on these and other Dickens programs, visit our website at icpl.org/Dickens. I'd like to thank a few organizations that have made this event possible: the UNESCO City of Literature, University of Iowa Department of English, University of Iowa Library Special Collections, Project on Rhetoric Inquiry, the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, Prairie Lights Bookstore, and the Crisis Center of Johnson County. I'd like to point out that there is a small exhibit in the back of Dickens materials here today. We'd like to thank Gregory Prickman at the University of Iowa Special Collections for sharing these items with us. And please stay after our panel discussion has concluded for a special reading by Tim Budd of Prairie Lights, and of course, cake and refreshments, because it's a birthday after all. Without further delay, let me introduce our panel. First up, we have Teresa Mangum, Professor of Victorian Literature in the University of Iowa English Department, Professor Jeffrey Cox in the British Social, Imperial, and Religious History at the University of Iowa History Department, Miriam Gilbert, Professor of Shakespeare, Drama, and Performance Criticism in the University of Iowa English Department, and Sarah Benson Witry, Food Bank and Emergency Assistance Director at the Crisis Center for Johnson County. Okay, turn over to you.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's really wonderful to see a room full of Dickensians, at least Dickensians for tonight. And I also really want to thank the Public Library and Anne Mangano and Maeve Clark, who were the brains behind this plan. And I wanted to just add one detail. The 25 books at Prairie Lights, of all 25 copies of Oliver Twist, in the Conversations and Controversies project that Poor Roy and the Obermann Center organize occasionally, we provide 25 free books at Prairie Lights to the first 25 people to come in and sign up to say you'll come to the discussion group. So I think we'll go later than Prairie Lights is open tonight, but you can bolt over there tomorrow and get your free book if you know you'd like to join us for the book discussion that Anne just mentioned. What we thought we would do as a panel tonight is to prepare you all both to celebrate Dickens' birthday and also to prepare you all for the book discussion that will come up in a few weeks, is to give you some things to think about as background for reading Oliver Twist, which is a general introduction to Dickens, but in particular Oliver Twist. And I need to figure this out. I want to start by, I want to talk about three thematic concerns that you see throughout Dickens' career, but especially in Oliver Twist, that you might be thinking about as you, those of you who read, but it'll be interesting, I hope, in any case. Dickens is often thought about as a writer who is celebrating the best of Victorian culture as well as critiquing the worst of Victorian culture. And one of the issues that surprises a lot of the new readers to Dickens is the way he addresses family. Very few Dickens novels have full families intact and functioning. They're often very dysfunctional, but what he offers as an alternative is fascinating examples of alternative families of affiliation or shared interest. Now, the pickpocket family we'll hear more about in a little while. But so William Powell Frith, this is later than Dickens was writing, but he captures part of what Dickens is already concerned about in the 1830s, and that is, as you can see in this painting, the disparity between the wealthy and the poor. And what's really fascinating in the Victorian period is because the cities are growing huge, especially London, for really the first time, if you've been watching Downton Abbey, as you know you probably have been, you know that there's this upstairs, downstairs culture, but once everybody goes to London, we're mixing the upper classes, the poor, and criminal classes. This fascinated Dickens, and he's very interested. Again, we see the idealized version of the Victorian family, and Dickens is really concerned about how different the ideal is from the reality he sees all around him in London. So that one of the issues that pervades his novels, and Oliver Twist is one of them, is his concern about children and about poor children. This is a painting that was, again, from later in the century, but of a street child, a shoeshine boy, and this is exactly the kind of child in Oliver Twist that Dickens is feeling such compassion for and resting. I mean, you have to remember, he has upper class and working and middle class, which in Britain means quite wealthy, audiences who simply don't want to know about poverty and these children on the street. Dickens is well aware of the fact that all across these new industrial cities, there are children as young as 5 years old, working in factories 16 hours a day. During the century, there is a gradual movement, but imagine that about the time Dickens is writing this novel, after much debate, Parliament decides that children 11 to 18 should only work 12 hours a day. This is what has Dickens raging in novels like Oliver Twist. He also, this 1833 Royal Commission decides that children under 9 should not be working, which is reminding us that they have been, and for these hours. And not until 1847 does the 10 Hours Act pass, which is a law that restricts women and children to working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. So when Dickens is protesting, when he paints this picture of the street children and the criminals, he's thinking about this terrible suffering that the general readers of novels are not interested in looking at. Just another few slides to give you a sense. This is an 1840s drawing of children working in a textile mill, and you can see how young they are. You can hardly tell, but there's a child way down under the mill who's been clearly sent in to do some repairs. This is an actual photograph from later in the century of what the Victorians tended to refer to as street urchins or street Arabs, as they called them. Another drawing of the 1840s, about the same time Dickens is writing Oliver Twist, a mines investigation, and you may have seen some of the drawings. They would send children in to drag carts because the tunnels were not tall enough to stand in. Not even for a child to stand in, and there are pictures like this of these poor children on their hands and knees dragging these carts from the depths of the mines. And again, this is before the 10 Hours Act is even passed. There is a movement that you see some evidence of in Oliver Twist, desire to educate children, beginning with what's called the Ragged School movement, Sunday schools basically that teach children to read and write. Another issue that Dickens is very compelled by, and we'll hear more about this from Miriam in a different way, is the fact that once you have all these different classes living together in London, people become much more aware of crime in the city. In 1856, there was a report done that attempted to capture arrest records, not crimes committed, but actual arrest. There were, in that year alone, 73,000 arrests were made. Of those, 46,000 were men and 30,000 women. And it's interesting to hear what people are getting arrested for, given what we see happen in Oliver Twist. 18,000 for drunkenness, 8,000 for theft, 7,000 simple larceny, 7,000 basically common assaults, 2,000 for assaults on police, and then almost 4,500 prostitutes. And these are just the people who are caught for criminal activity. So that there is, even though there's this new police force that's at work, there's tremendous anxiety about who is in the streets of London brushing up against your coach and your, as you move through this, as the wealthier people move through the streets. Later in the century, there's a whole science that emerges around the belief that you can actually recognize the physical features of criminals. In women, I'm always interested that if you have a very strong jaw, very bad news. But this is a science called physiognomy, and you can see these are all pictures of people, of known criminals, where the social scientists are trying to figure out what are those shared features that would let us identify criminals. A completely quack science, let me be sure everybody knows. Another illustration from Gustave Doré's amazing series of drawings of London's, again, later than Dickens' novel, but Dickens was known to walk the streets of London. He was with a police inspector whom he had befriended, and you get a sense, there's in 1840s, there is no gas lighting, there's no electricity in the streets of London. And I think this picture with what's called a bullseye, a kind of lantern that throws this light, just imagine walking through these streets in the slums and discovering these people living on the streets. And Dickens is seeing this night after night. He was known to walk 30 miles a day at times. He was so riveted by the world around him in London. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I turn things over to Jeff is the fallen woman figure. As you're reading Oliver Twist, you'll encounter a character many of you already are familiar with called Nancy. You'll notice that the novel carefully never calls Nancy a prostitute, although later, when Dickens writes a preface to the novel, he's been accused of being vulgar. Why would you want to write about criminals? Why would you write about this horrible woman who is drunken and rages against the men who abuse her? And Dickens said, because we need to be talking about prostitutes, he would have, and recognizing our responsibility for creating this enormous class, 8,000, 9,000 easily in the moment he's writing this, and that's just a very low estimate. But what he's writing against is a fantasy we see over and over again in Victorian novels, not of prostitution, but of what the Victorians call the fallen woman. And the fallen woman is a figure who, think about the biblical notion of the fall. She starts in the paradise of the middle class or upper class family. Something goes wrong, she's seduced by a lover, or her family loses all of their money and she's thrown, she has no resources to rely on. The phrase is used over again, she's seduced and abandoned. And so here we see the woman being thrown out of her family in the Redgrave portrait, a very famous Rossetti painting of a man who is apparently discovering either his wife or a woman he's known, and notice that lamb that's in the net, caught in a trap beside her. So she's clearly being equated with this innocent, destroyed, probably by some man's lust. And the assumption was these good women could only end up dead. Now, part of what Dickens wants to say is, let's talk about the other women who are not fallen from anything but struggling to survive, and often using prostitution as a way station between one job and another. And so he really asks us to be compassionate about the fallen woman he wants to show us, the actual prostitute. And when you see the relationship between Nancy and Oliver, I think you'll be really fascinated, those of you who haven't read the novel. thanks, and I'm going to turn things over to Jeff, who will talk about Workhouse and the poor law.
Thank you, Teresa. You're getting a big dose of Southern accents tonight, but lucky you. You know, we're an oppressed and persecuted minority, white Southerners here, so it's good to have some diversity coming up on this. Here's the Workhouse. This is what it was like. You know, the most famous scene in all of Dickens, I think, is Oliver Twist when he comes up to the front of the workhouse and asks for more. You all know that scene. It's in the musical. You know, it's been repeated over and over. And why were there workhouses? And Dickens, you know, was familiar with these. And why did Dickens hate them so much? That's the question. Well, this is a question that can only be answered by a historian. In 1601, the government of England established the Elizabethan Poor Law. This was to deal with the problem of beggars. There were lots of beggars around. That's the way they saw it. They weren't really beggars. They were people looking for work. I mean, you're beginning to get a capitalist labor market in 1601, and people are out of place. And the government of England began classifying people into two categories, which are still with us under different names. These beggars they wanted to distinguish one kind of beggar from another. There was the sturdy beggar. This was somebody who could work, but didn't want to. And then there was the impotent beggar. I love that, the impotent beggar. This is in the legislation. The impotent beggar was somebody who needed help because they could, and so they decided to classify them. And what they first, you know, in the late 16th century, they decided to round up the sturdy beggars and whip them. This was the way to encourage them to go into the labor market, and then send them back to their home parish. But there was always a recognition that there were some impotent beggars, most of them women, a lot of them unwed mothers, who really couldn't be expected to go into the labor market. So they started with the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601 to create workhouses in every parish. And one of the things that happened in England in 1601 was that they're the first country in Europe, and they did something that we haven't done in this country at all. They created for the central government an obligation to keep people alive. It was an entitlement. You know, if the government had to. And furthermore, they created an administrative bureaucracy in which the government officials could be prosecuted if they didn't keep people alive. You know, you're not supposed to let people die on the streets. You're supposed to provide them with welfare, what we would call welfare, right? Food stamps and so forth. We don't have any comparable entitlement in this country. We have different things that people could use to help. And so what this did was create a government welfare system which was contradictory in a major way. For poor people, it was, on the one hand, an entitlement which they appreciated, but it was also a humiliation. Because in order to make sure this didn't undermine the labor market, the government created circumstances in which if you had to come in hat in hand and ask for more, you were put in a legal category called as a pauper. You lost your civil rights. You were humiliated in various ways and so forth. And so it created contradictory attitudes among poor people and wage earners generally toward this. On the one hand, great, unlike France, we have an obligation to be kept alive. But on the other hand, we're forced to humiliate ourselves by declaring ourselves poor and the government. And it also created contradictions for the tax-paying public who had to pay basically local property taxes to support this. And it created a kind of swing of the pendulum between kindness and harshness, going back and forth. You know, sometimes people would say, "Oh, it's horrible that there are all these homeless people. We have to help them." And then they would say, "These are really sturdy beggars. Get a job." You know, they could go sorry. This pendulum kept swinging back and forth. Well, in the early 19th century, there was a big swing of the pendulum toward harshness, which created the circumstances which Dickens reacted against, right? This is the circumstance. In the 1834 Poor Law, which is called the New Poor Law. It's always called the New Poor Law. I love the use of the word new in Britain. What is New College, Oxford? It's what, 1470 or something. And so the New Poor Law of 1834, unlike the Old Poor Law of 1601, that's what it's called. And they decided that now is the time to make government welfare policy conform more closely to the marketplace, to force people into the labor market. You're very familiar with this. We're in a big swing of the pendulum to the harsh side right now, dating from Clinton's welfare reform and Obamacare and various to make government welfare policies conform to the logic of the marketplace. And so what they did in 1834 is that they said, well, we're going to force everybody in the country into a workhouse, and we're going to create humiliating conditions in the workhouse. We're going to separate elderly people who are married from each other and put them in separate parts of it. We're going to remove the obligation of a father to support an illegitimate child. They did that so that, you know, it's an incentive for women not to get pregnant. They created a kind of crackdown on the poor to force them into a humiliating sort of welfare system based on the workhouse. It, of course, didn't work. They couldn't afford to build workhouses, for one thing. And so the whole thing broke down. The worst aspect of this is that they, in order to deal with the crisis in medical education, they decided that anyone who died in a workhouse could be given to a medical school for dissection, right? People in Britain, poor people especially, but all people, had a huge horror of having their bodies desecrated after they died, a huge horror of it. And so part of it's actually the 1832 Anatomy Act, which preceded the 1834 Poor Law. So if you die, this was to create fear among working people. If you go to the workhouse when you're old, you'll be separated from your spouse. If you go in and die there, your body, instead of being given a decent burial, you'll be dissected. Something like 50,000 corpses were sent from workhouses to medical schools in the 19th century. It was an absolute humiliation. And this was Dickens' Oliver Twist is part of the reaction against this, a very sharp reaction. Here's one right here. Here's what's happening in the workhouse. Everyone's being hung upside down and whipped and so forth. I mean, the new workhouse in Manchester, which was built as a result of this act, was torn down brick by an angry mob. Just demolished. People were so angry that their entitlement to decent treatment. But, you know, this just went on. I mean, the reaction against it was based on a notion that it was cruel and it could be solved if people were kind. That's really what Oliver Twist is about. And indeed, I think Dickens, much of what Dickens has to say is really a case for kindness. And that's, I think, what's so moving about it and what's so admirable about him. I mean, he had the same kind of criticism of government educational policy. I don't know if you've read Hard Times, but there was a parallel movement to reform education with government grants, which involved payment by results, teaching to the test, central administration. And Dickens in Hard Times goes after this teacher, Mr. McChokumchild, who's the utilitarian teacher. I think this is a great name for Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, McChokumchild. But I will say this, and I know that I'm a little reluctant to say this now because I know this is a celebratory gathering for someone who's dead. But I have to say I think Dickens was in his campaign for kindness a bit of a coward. He never goes against the top powerful people who are in charge of these policies. He goes after mid-level functionaries, like the poor law administrator who denies Oliver Twist his moor. It's not his fault. It's not even McChokumchild's fault. It's the government's fault for Whig government, the left of the possible. The liberals of the day, they're the ones who are responsible for putting these things into effect. And if you'll read Dickens, I think you'll see that Dickens has a way of picking on people who can't fight back. Bradley Headstone and Great Expect. I just always am so annoyed by his treatment of upward mobility and his critique of it. But setting that aside, we'll take kindness where we can get it. And we get a lot of kindness from Dickens. Dickens contributed a lot to the undermining of the legitimacy of the poor law. But it took a very long time before this kind of reaction, most of which took the form of going to church and joining church organizations that help the poor. that really is where this outpouring of help. A lot of people thought the poor law is cruel. We'll just help the people down the street by helping them directly. We'll give them charity directly on this. And there was a vast, it's one of the real bulwarks of the growth of the Christian churches in Victorian England, is real sense that the poor law is cruel and we're kind, because we've read the words of our Lord in the King James Version of the New Testament. And so you get this outpouring of sort of ad hoc and local help. There was hardly a parish church in England that didn't have a ladies' district visiting society that visited every poor family to try to be kind to them. Sometimes they were pelted with unpleasant substances when they came into the neighborhood. They weren't always welcome. You know the phrase, cold as charity. But still, I'm on their side. But what didn't happen until the 20th century was something that Dickens didn't provide, which was a serious critique of the principles of the poor law, which is that people who need help should have to be designated as poor and ask for help. That is what we think of as welfare. You begin to get, starting with the 1908 Old Age Pension Act in Britain, the 1911 National Insurance Act, 1946 National Insurance Act, the 1948 National Health Insurance, and also in this country with Social Security, and later in the 60s with Medicare, a different principle of welfare, which is that it's an entitlement, not a grant, that you don't have to prove yourself poor, right? And it was really that sort of two waves of criticism of the poor law. The first is that it's cruel, which Dickens was crucial in this, although he wasn't alone. But the second is the 20th century critique of having people come in and say, as they have to do under Obamacare, I can't afford health insurance, I need help from the government, I have to prove I'm poor. That critique, we had to wait until the 20th century for that. But we have to give people credit where credit is due, and Dickens did an enormous amount to undermine the legitimacy of a system that was inherently cruel.
Jeff and I have taught together in the past. We love team teaching, and we always are suggesting to each other things we should do. So I tried to convince Jeff to do additional PowerPoints, and he would not. He was not interested, so I'll just quickly show you those before Miriam's. You should see us in the classroom together. So just a quick workhouse, what the educational system within the workhouse looked like, and a beautiful painting by von Herkimer. He painted several scenes within workhouses of the elderly that Jeff mentioned.
Good. Can you get to, okay, and can we get to the next? Yeah. And do you want to pass out the stuff? Do I just click?
Roll.
Okay. But not enough, because I had no idea there were going to be so many. So while Teresa does that, I should just say that I didn't realize we were supposed to do Southern accents tonight. I left Alabama in 1953, so it was a while ago. My Southern accent is way back in my past. I've called my talk tonight, Who is Fagin? Which may seem a sort of a silly question. Fagin is, after all, one of the two best-known Jews in English literature. The other is Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, and both are compelling figures. Both exist in texts that refer to them repeatedly as the Jew, and both have raised major questions about their authors' feelings, attitudes towards Jews. As a teacher of Shakespeare and as a Jew, I confront the problem every time I teach The Merchant of Venice, which I'm doing just now. And in just 3 weeks, I'll be speaking here in much more detail about Shylock as a prelude to Riverside Theater's production of the play this summer. That's on March 1st. But I don't usually get to teach Dickens, and so the invitation to think about Fagin for tonight's presentation has led me into some fascinating reading and rereading, beginning with Oliver Twist, a novel that this time around reduced me helplessly to tears. The opening section of the novel is particularly poignant, as Oliver Twist is abused, isolated, thrown out of every possible uncomfortable place to live, and finally winds up walking for days to London, where, amazingly enough, he finds, for the first time in the novel, not simply enough food to eat and a warm place to sleep, but human companionship. And supplying those needs is, amazingly enough, Fagin the Jew, the receiver of stolen goods, the trainer of young boys in the ways of stealing. He's introduced in a memorable passage, which is the first one on your sheet, but I'm going to read this because the details are crucial. The walls and ceiling of the room were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire, upon which were a candle stuck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf and butter, and a plate. In a frying pan which was on the fire and which was secured to the mantel shelf by a string, some sausages were cooking, not kosher. And standing over them with a toasting fork in his hand was a very old, shriveled Jew, whose villainous-looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. He was dressed in a greasy flannel gown with his throat bare and seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying pan and a clothes horse, over which a great number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. Several rough beds made of old sacks were huddled side by side, thank you, on the floor, and seated round the table were 4 or 5 boys, none older than the Dodger, smoking long clay pipes and drinking spirits with the air of middle-aged men. These all crowded round their associate as he whispered a few words to the Jew, and then turned round and grinned at Oliver, as did the Jew himself, toasting fork in hand. "This is him, Fagin," said Jack Dawkins, "my friend, Oliver Twist." The masterful combination here of seeming opposites, the grotesque details, the villainous looking and repulsive face, the matted red hair, an allusion to Judas Iscariot, and stage Jews frequently had red hair, the greasy flannel gown, the non-kosher sausages. All of those things, the dirt that's all over this, that's one side. But there's also this sense of community with the boys sitting around the table, the grinning welcome, and most poignantly, and I do start crying, the introduction by the artful Dodger of Oliver as his friend. When so far has anyone called Oliver a friend? And this combination, I think, points to the peculiar power that lies in Dickens's creation of Fagin. He is the Jew, but he is also the provider of food, the merry old gentleman, almost the motherly figure who welcomes Oliver. "We're very glad to see you, Oliver." "Very," said the Jew. "Dodger, take off the sausages and draw a tub near the fire for Oliver." "Ah, you're staring at the pocket handkerchiefs. Eh, my dear? There are a good many of 'em, ain't there? We just looked 'em out ready for the wash. That's all, Oliver, that's all." Even as Dickens repeats the Jew, he also creates the sense of Fagin as a protector. That phrase, "my dear," will be repeated throughout the novel, becoming increasingly sinister as we recognize Fagin's power. But at the first meeting, such a phrase must be music to Oliver's ears. And of course, we also have the drawing accompanying this scene by George Cruikshank, whose visualization of Fagin also stays in one's memory. That's the scene where Fagin to your left, Oliver to your right, the toasting fork is just over here. Indeed, one might argue that it is Cruikshank as much as Dickens who has created the villainous look for Fagin. Here's another Fagin. There he is off to the right, and you see, again, that sort of shaggy look for him. And to show you how powerful this is, look at 2 contemporary versions of Fagin. Alec Guinness in the film, but clearly indebted to Cruikshank. Ron Moody in the musical. Still, you can see that it's exactly that same kind of person. And that's what we think Fagin looks like. What's interesting to me is not simply his villainy, although he is not only trying to destroy Oliver, but succeeds in getting Nancy murdered, but the way in which Dickens seems to have entered imaginatively into Fagin's mind. For most of the novel, we look at Fagin. But starting in chapter 44, Fagin starts to think about Nancy, and Dickens, somewhat surprisingly, takes us inside Fagin's mind as he starts trying to figure out what Nancy is doing. And for part of the chapter, we're actually following his thinking. What he's imagining is he's trying to figure out why she's trying to get away from Bill Sikes, and he thinks she's got a lover waiting for her somewhere. Now, we know that he's wrong. Nancy doesn't have a new lover, but she does have a new attachment. She is trying to save Oliver Twist, and she's stolen away to reveal, or she's trying to steal away to reveal to Oliver's friends the danger that the boy is in. What I think is interesting is that Dickens puts the thoughts, scheming and manipulative as they are, in front of the reader by writing from within Fagin's point of view. We are forced into sharing his mind, even though we know he hopes to gain more power over Nancy. And thus, just as we listen to the scheming of an Iago or a Richard III, we become slightly complicit. And at the end of the novel, Dickens goes even further, giving us almost an entire chapter from Fagin's point of view. The chapter starts with everyone looking at him. All looks were fixed on one man, the Jew. But then Dickens tells us what Fagin is looking at, how he scans the gallery. And I don't know why the slides keep disappearing, but there we go. The jury, the space, even noticing the iron spikes before him and wondering how the head of one of them had broken off and whether they would mend it or leave it as it was. Dickens takes us not only into the cell, but into Fagin's mind. Can you get the slides back? Why did it go off? Okay. Well, never mind. As he counts the time, the hours. And in the chapter, The Jew's Last Night Alive, Dickens makes us feel the horror of Fagin's fear. And although we never stop judging him, we also feel with him. So I'm struck by this doubleness that we have with Fagin. And I think that this comes from, in some ways, his antecedents in English literature. And I'm also struck by the kind of explanations people have to try and explain away what looks like really deep anti-Semitism. The antecedents. If you know Merchant of Venice, you know that Shylock is equally a figure of contention, villain or victim, my students ask. We also have Barabbas, the Jew of Malta, in Marlowe's play. Well, it'll come, it won't. Who brags at length of the awful things he's done. These are figures I will talk more about in a few weeks, but they are two of the major Jewish figures from Shakespeare's time, and they're both villains, and yet they are both victims of the Christian community in which they live. But there are figures who are a lot closer to Fagin, and I want to mention two. One I had never really heard of till I started working on this. The other is more familiar. In 1794, about 40 years before Dickens got going on Oliver Twist, Richard Cumberland wrote a play called The Jew, which seemed to be a deliberate answer to The Merchant of Venice. Sheva, the Jew, is a good man. He's got a comic servant who, like Shylock, likes to eat a lot. He worries about lending money, but he always lends the money. And what's more, he turns out to be a generous money lender, and even he's a benefactor. He gives 10,000 pounds to a young woman who has married secretly but has been, shunned by the husband's father because he doesn't know that she's got all this money, and he objects to the secret marriage. The play is, admittedly, not a major play. I expect you haven't heard of it. But Cumberland's attempts to present a good, though still comically miserly and accented Jew, are noteworthy. And when we first meet Sheva, he starts talking about himself. He's accused of rolling in riches, and he says, "The world knows no great deal of me. I live sparingly and labor hard. Therefore I am called a miser. I cannot help it. An uncharitable dog, I must endure it. A bloodsucker, an extortioner, a Shylock. Hard names, Mr. Frederick, but what can a poor Jew say in return if a Christian choose to abuse him?" And then he goes on to say, "We," meaning the Jews, "have no abiding place on earth, no country, no home. Everybody rails at us, everybody flouts us, everybody points us out for their May game and their mockery. How can you expect us to show kindness when we receive none?" And the really crucial point is that some other person supports him, a Christian. That is true, friend Sheva, I can witness. I am sorry to say there is too much justice in your complaint. So here we have somebody putting the case for the Jew and a Christian supporting it. It's, of course, also noticeable. That's all right, not to worry, just skip it. A much more familiar figure, however, is Isaac of York, who appears in Sir Walter Scott's 1819 success, Ivanhoe. And once again, I've got a long quotation on the sheet, we get a defense of Jews, and here it comes from the narrator, not from the Jew himself, talking about why and how much Jews are persecuted. I'll just give you one sentence. upon the slightest and most unreasonable pretenses, as well as upon accusations the most absurd and groundless, their persons and property were exposed to every turn of popular fury. For Norman, Saxon, Dane, and Briton, however adverse these races were to each other, contended which should look with greatest detestation upon a people whom it was accounted a point of religion to hate, to revile, to despise, to plunder, and to persecute. Never use one word where you can use 3 or 5, as I discovered when typing out Scott's quotations. But I find it so fascinating that he defends Isaac of York. And even though the presentation of Isaac is often of a comic, almost miserly, certainly scared man, Scott, as narrator, says everybody is persecuting them. And what's more, he gives us the stunning figure of Rebecca, Isaac's daughter. She is a figure of exotic beauty, defiant chastity. You may remember the scene where she is going to jump out the window to repel the Knight Templar who's coming after her. But what is most interesting is that Scott allows her to critique not just Christians and Jews, but the whole system of chivalry on which one might argue the novel is based. And in a passage where Ivanhoe is lying wounded and she is having to describe to him the battle that is going on, she talks about it in disparaging terms. She says, "What is it, valiant knight, save an offering of sacrifice to a demon of vainglory and a passing through the fire to Moloch? What remains to you as a prize of all the blood you have spilled, of all the travail and pain you have endured?" In other words, what's the point of all this fighting? "What remains," echoed Ivanhoe, "glory, maiden, glory, which gilds our sepulchre and embalms our name." "Glory," continued Rebecca, "alas, is the rusted mail which hangs as a hatchment over the champion's dim and moldering tomb." "Is this glory?" she says. She sounds like Hotspur saying, "What's honor? Who hath it? He who died a Wednesday." And she goes on at some length. But it is one of the most stunning critiques of the idea of fighting, of physical prowess, and so on. And it seems to me it is because she is an outsider that she is allowed to make that, and that what is happening is that Scott is really using the Jew as the figure who can somehow give that critique. I don't know that that tells us that that justifies Fagin. I'm not sure there is a way to justify Fagin as the Jew. But I think it's worth pointing out that even in Dickens's time, there was a strong reaction against him. Mrs. Eliza Davis, the wife of the man who bought Dickens's house, complained to Dickens about Fagin. And she even wrote him a letter in which she suggested that he had done Jews a great wrong. Dickens replied by saying, "Well, I'm just sort of following what's going on. Fagin is a Jew because it is unfortunately true of the time to which that story refers that that class of criminal almost invariably was a Jew." And she said, "I don't think so." There was a well-known fence, Ike Solomon's. He may have been referring to him. Dickens then, I think, strategic error, said all of the other wicked characters were Christians, and went on to say that Fagin is called a Jew not because of his religion, but because of his race. Having opened the door, Dickens should not have been surprised that Mrs. Davis walked in, replying in another letter that in Oliver Twist there were some good Christians in contrast with the criminals, whilst this poor wretched Fagin stands alone, and she mentioned her gratitude to Sir Walter Scott. And at that point, Dickens seemed to get the picture. First, in Our Mutual Friend, he creates an almost saintly Jew, Rhea, totally unbelievable for many people, but certainly a good figure. But then, a few years later, he revised his novels for a collected edition, taking out, at least in the last 10 or 12 chapters of the novel, many, many, many references to the Jew. And the chapter that I was talking about, where you see things from Fagin's point of view, in the original book, it's called The Jew's Last Night Alive. In the revised version, it's called Fagin's Last Night Alive. So, in some sense, he tried to make amends for that. And I think I need to stop now because I need to let Sarah have a go. More stuff later. Thank you.
So my presentation is going to be completely different. I'm actually going to be talking about the present time. However, I knew coming into this from what I do know about Dickens, and I will admit I was assigned The Tale of Two Cities in 10th grade, didn't read all of it, and have since not done other readings. But Wikipedia is really helpful. But in listening to our other presenters tonight, it is very clear the themes that Dickens brings up about poverty and about the struggles and about children in poverty. A lot of those themes are still very true today. And in that, it makes perfect sense that Maeve and the committee asked that I come speak about hunger today, and not just 200 years ago in Britain, but right here in our community. So in the US in 2010, about 15.1% of the population was in poverty. And that's 22% of the children in the US. You'll see this now, and you'll see this again in the stats, that children typically are worse off than the general population. In Iowa and Johnson County, it's 12% of Iowans, and interestingly enough, 18% of Johnson County. So we actually are in a county that is typically thought of as more affluent, more urban, and actually with these stats, we are looking at a higher rate of poverty, and my screen has shut off. I don't know what's going on tonight. So an example of poverty in our county. Let's take a single mother with 2 children. The average household size is just between 2 and 3 people. Oh, it's a touch screen. And many of the people in poverty are single mothers, so this is a common scenario. So poverty, defined by the U.S. Census, for a family of 3 is with an annual income for that family of $17,568, something below that. So monthly, her budget is at $1,463. Her rent for a 3-bedroom, because we've got 1 school-aged male and 1 infant female, so we've got a 3-bedroom. That's going to be about $1,000, a little bit more. Her utilities, probably about $120. That could be lucky in some places and a little high in others, but that's a pretty fair amount, which leaves her about $313 of her paycheck each month to try to make it for the rest. That's $72 a week to pay for food, toiletries, educational expenses, clothing, transportation. Has anyone heard about this whole over $4 a gallon by May thing? And fun. And fun, of course, is important. We all need to have some sort of emotional well-being as well. For a person at this income level, she is going to be receiving some government assistance. Not anything like the Elizabethan Poor Laws, fortunately. She will be receiving some child care assistance. She will be receiving some food assistance, medical care assistance, all of those from the government. So she is going to have some help. But if we look at the maximum food assistance from the federal government, that's going to be the EBT, Electronics Benefit Transfer, or food stamps, commonly known. For a family of 3, the max benefit is $526 a month. That's for a family with no income. She's at the top of the income level, so she's going to be receiving actually very little of assistance with that food. So, if you've got $72 a month to try to make it, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be making some tough choices. So families that are receiving assistance from anti-hunger programs are choosing between paying for food and utilities or heating oil, food and rent or mortgage, food and medical care or medicine, food and transportation. These are some really tough choices, and a lot of those things people wouldn't consider optional. So what is this not having enough food, making choices about food? It's food insecurity. not having access at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life for all household members. And a lot of times what we see with that is the kids, they get dinner at night, and maybe mom and dad sit down for that too, but when mom and dad go to work, mysteriously, they don't have lunch. The kids maybe get free and reduced lunch at school, mom and dad don't. So in the United States, because a lot of times when we talk about poverty and you think about the images of hungry children, in fact, I Googled images of hungry children, it was a lot of starving children in Africa, and that is what we typically think of. But there are hungry children here. In 2010, 16% of Americans lived in food insecure households, not having steady access to food. That was 32.6 million adults and 16.2 million children. Again, you'll see that 16% in the general population, 22% of children. Once again, children are having a harder time with this. That's 1 in 7 households being food insecure. That does mean that in this room today, there is probably a food insecure person. Some households, some types, had higher rates. So if we're looking at households with children, it goes from 1 in 7 to 1 in 5. Single mom households and single dad households are 1 in 3 households or 1 in 4. It's really, really probable. And if we're looking at racial disparity, 1 in 4 Black or Hispanic households. And you can see we got the Black, non-Hispanic. That is going to be the government census definition. Food insecurity exists in every county in America, ranging from 5% in Steele County, North Dakota, to 38% in Wilcox County, Alabama. So this is everywhere. Speaking of everywhere, what's it like in our county? 13.4% of our population is food insecure here in Johnson County. 55% of those families are eligible for SNAP, that is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or food stamps. 1% isn't eligible for SNAP, but they're eligible for some other things. But 44% are not eligible for most types of benefits. So these are people who do not have adequate access to food, but are not considered poor by our government. If you look at children specifically, it goes up to 16.9%, 45% eligible for SNAP. The majority, however, 55% of food insecure children, not eligible for that program. All right, so I'm from the Crisis Center. I've got to plug my organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the population that I see. So who we serve. 91% of our clients are below the poverty line. Now the poverty line versus the poverty threshold for the census are a little different, but fairly consistent. The other 9% are below 80% of the area median income or less. So 100% of our clients are considered low income by the government definition. This does mean that many of our clients are eligible for SNAP benefits for those food stamps. However, like I was saying with that sample family, a lot of families don't get very much. And even for a family with 0 income, family of 3, max benefit is $526 a month. I would have trouble with that, especially if I'm feeding some teenage children. Close to 50% of our client families have at least one family member employed. And anecdotally, we get an employment guide from the Department of Human Services, and this is places that are hiring this week. We get it every single week. And we are astounded at how many copies leave our agency and how many copies we have to make. It can be 60, 75, 80, upwards to 100 copies each week of this guide of people actively wanting a job and looking for employment. It's very interesting when we were talking about the two definitions of the poor, the people essentially who could work but don't want to, was the assumption, and the people who couldn't and therefore deserved help, albeit a twisted sense of help. And really what we see is that people, if they aren't looking for work, it's because they've given up. It's because they've tried for so long and have just can't put themselves out there like that anymore. Nearly 50% of the people who receive our services are under the age of 18, are children. Obviously, they're not coming in, and 6-year-olds not receiving food for themselves, but they are benefiting from our services through their households. So how much are we doing in this county? We distribute nearly 40,000 food sacks annually. It's a lot. And we're serving around 4,500 different households a year. Last year, that equated to over 10,000 individuals. And you know from the statistic that I gave you previously that in our county, there's about 16,000 food insecure people. So we're not there yet, but we're going to keep working. And actually, this year so far, we've seen a significant jump in how many people we're serving, 22% increase. About 70%, possibly 75% in the last year percent of the food that we give out is directly from donations. Thank you for the peanut butter, by the way. The other 30% is purchased from another nonprofit, the Haycat Food Reservoir, from Hy-Vee, they give me a deal, and from other sources. So addressing hunger at the food bank. We provide a supplemental bag of food, which people can receive once weekly. It really goes back to that dignity and respect of the people who are in poverty. Within the last year, we switched to a system where our clients can choose the foods that they need. That's better for the culturally, it's better for clients' dignity. Again, that whole idea that people have to prove that they're poor and have to be humiliated, we don't really buy into that. So we don't have any income guidelines, which I think from the data that you've been hearing about, that makes a lot of sense. And the people are able to pick what they're needing. We do attempt to provide a variety of items. We're always excited by things like gluten-free products and other things where people with dietary restrictions can have their needs met as well. We do have perishables and non-perishables. I will talk a little bit about Table to Table a little later on. It's a great source of perishable items for us. And we also provide some hygiene, cleaning items, baby products, stuff like that. Something you may not know is that food stamps, EBT, whatever you want to call it, does not cover anything except food. So toilet paper, not covered. We also provide lots of referrals to a lot of different places, including the Iowa EBT program. And indeed, more than 50% of our clients do receive EBT. Something that's interesting, and I think this conversation about the Jew in Oliver Twist has its own poignancy today. So here's a little graph of Johnson County population by race. That's according to the census. You can see we're white. This is my client population. It's a very, very different graph. 20% of my clients are Hispanic or Latino, and 29% are African American. And this is not because, what was that whole thing? Well, all the criminals of the time are Jews, and that's why I had to write them like that. That is not what we're looking at. There's a lot of disparity going on, even in our community, that is a lot more complicated than blaming it on the people that we're serving. So I was really excited to hear Jeff have that conversation, and also Miriam. So our mission, because food bank's not all we do, is to answer in a non-judgmental and caring way. We provide immediate resources and referrals, and we work collaboratively to help prevent for future needs. So we have 5 programs. Crisis intervention, that's going to be our 24/7 crisis hotline. We specialize in suicide prevention, part of the National Lifeline Network. We also have a new program, Crisis Chat, so people can receive services via instant message on the internet. Community intervention, we go out in the community to do suicide survivor support, to provide trainings out in the community on suicide. Disaster relief, we were a big role in the 2008 flood here. Food bank, of course. We also have emergency financial assistance for clients with emergency needs. Most of that is helping with rent, utilities, those really basic bills, but also things like work boots to help people start a job. You have to have those steel-toed boots, but the steel-toed boots could cost $30 to $45. We can help you with those. You need ID to get a job? We can help you with ID. A lot of variety of needs that we help with in that program. But we're not alone. Other programs in our county to help the hunger. There are 4 other pantries in our county that serve much smaller areas. We will serve anyone in Johnson County, but there are other pantries for smaller communities. And we all work together in an organization called Hunger Project to try to be the most efficient and effective that we can for these families in hunger. Table to Table is a food rescue organization. So they take food that was otherwise going to be wasted, that is perfectly nutritious and wholesome, and they provide it to organizations such as the Crisis Center. Free Lunch Program and Salvation Army both do meals. Free Lunch Program is lunch 6 days a week. Salvation Army is dinner 7 days a week now. Nationally, Feeding America is a great program. They are a national food bank network. They provide a lot of support on a national network, a national level, and they also hook up these corporate sponsors, Nabisco, General Mills, kind of those larger places, Tyson, with food banks in their area. So that Haycat Food Reservoir that I mentioned receives food because of their connection with Feeding America, as well as some things from the federal government. And then Bread for the World is a Christian-based organization, but they do some great advocacy, especially for public policy. They've been talking a lot about the budget changes in the last year for the federal government and trying to advocate to protect food programs. So really, there is a lot going on that we're trying to do, but as you can see, there are also a lot of people in need. I always feel bad when I have these talks because then I feel like I'm like, and the world is in trouble. But really, there are a lot of things, a lot of places doing good, and there's a lot of places that you can participate. Even something as simple as a food drive during a talk like this is amazing and greatly appreciated. Ultimately, hunger is not just a problem in Dickens' time, and although he did a great job of bringing it to light, but it does exist in our own community, and there are many ways to help. So, thank you.
We are happy to answer questions if you like, but we're also we also have a short reading by Tim Budd, so that we might want to move to that unless someone has a pressing question that you'd like. We'd be happy to stop and talk first. It actually might bring us back to Dickens a little bit if we did the reading. Maybe that would be a good idea, although we thought the whole group thought it was very important to think about the relationship between all of the protest and Oliver Twist and what we should want to be thinking about today in our own community.
My name's Tim Budd. I'm an employee at Prairie Lights, and I'd like to add, just to follow up, that for the month of February, to celebrate Dickens' birthday, any Dickens books you buy in the bookstore, any books written by Dickens, I should say, half of our profits will be donated to the food bank. So you can sort of, we should thank Jan Weissmiller and Jane Mead, for the owners of the store, for that. But at the same time, you can experience Dickens, celebrate his birthday, read about the problems he had, and help with the problems that we have today. And I suppose all of Dickens' books are free on Kindle, but you won't be helping the community if you do that. Enough said. Oliver Twist, Chapter 47, Fatal Consequences. It was nearly 2 hours before daybreak, that time which, in the autumn of the year, may be truly called the dead of night, when the streets are silent and deserted, when even sounds appear to slumber, and profligacy and riot have staggered home to dream. It was at this still and silent hour that Fagin sat watching in his old lair, with face so distorted and pale, and eyes so red and bloodshot, that he looked less like a man than like some hideous phantom, moist from the grave, and worried by an evil spirit. He sat crouching over a cold hearth, wrapped in an old torn coverlet, with his face turned towards a wasting candle that stood upon a table by his side. His right hand was raised to his lips, and as, Absorbed in thought, he bit his long black nails. He disclosed among his toothless gums a few such fangs as should have been a dog's or rat's. Stretched upon a mattress on the floor lay Noah Claypole, fast asleep. Towards him the old man sometimes directed his eyes for an instant and then brought them back again to the candle, which, with a long burnt wick of drooping almost double and hot grease falling down in clots upon the table, plainly showed that his thoughts were busy elsewhere. Indeed, they were. Mortification at the overthrow of his notable scheme, hatred of the girl who had dared to palter with strangers, an utter distrust of the sincerity of her refusal to yield him up, bitter disappointment at the loss of his revenge on Sykes, the fear of detection and ruin and death, and a fierce and deadly rage kindled by all. These were the passionate considerations which, following close upon each other with rapid and ceaseless whirl, shot through the brain of Fagin, as every evil thought and blackest purpose lay working at his heart. He sat without changing his attitude in the least, or appearing to take the smallest heed of time, until his quick ears seemed to be attracted by a footstep in the street. "At last," he muttered, wiping his dry and fevered mouth. "At last." The bell rang gently as he spoke. He crept upstairs to the door and presently returned accompanied by a man muffled to the chin, who carried a bundle under one arm. Sitting down and throwing back his outer coat, the man displayed the burly frame of Sykes. "There," he said, laying the bundle on the table. "Take care of that and do the most you can with it. It's been trouble enough to get. I should have been here 3 hours ago." Fagin laid his hand upon the bundle and, locking it in the cupboard, sat down again without speaking. But he did not take his eyes off the robber for an instant during this action, and now that they sat over against each other, face to face, he looked fixedly at him, with his lips quivering so violently and his face so altered by the emotions which had mastered him, that the housebreaker involuntarily drew back his chair and surveyed him with a look of real affright. "What now?" cried Sykes. "What are you looking at a man like that for?" Fagin raised his right hand and shook his trembling forefinger in the air, but his passion was so great that the power of speech was for the moment gone. "Damn me," said Sykes, feeling in his breast with a look of alarm. "He's gone mad. I must look to myself here." "No, no," rejoined Fagin, finding his voice. You're not the person, Bill. I've no fault to find with you." "Oh, you haven't you?" said Sykes, looking sternly at him and ostentatiously passing a pistol into a more convenient pocket. "That's lucky, for one of us. Which one that is, don't matter." "I've got that to tell you, Bill," said Fagin, drawing his chair nearer. "Will make you worse than me." "Aye?" returned the robber with an incredulous air. "Tell away! Look sharp, or Nance will think I'm lost." "Lost?" cried Fagin. "She has pretty well settled that in her own mind already, Bill." Sykes looked with an aspect of great perplexity into the Jew's face, and reading no satisfactory explanation of the riddle there, clenched his coat collar in his huge hand and shook him soundly. "Speak, will you?" he said, "or if you don't, it shall be for want of breath. Open your mouth and say what you've got to say in plain words. Out with it, you thundering old cur, out with it." Sykes turned round to where Noah was sleeping. "Suppose that lad that's lying there," Fagin began. Fagin turned again to Noah, as if he had not previously observed him. "Well?" said Bill, resuming his former position. "Suppose that lad," pursued Fagin, "was to peach, to blow upon us all, first seeking out the right folks for the purpose, and then having a meeting with them in the street to paint our likenesses, describe every mark that they might know us by, and the crib where we might be most easily taken. Suppose he was to do all this, and besides to blow upon a plant we've all been in, more or less, of his own fancy, not grabbed, trapped, tried, earwigged by the parson and brought to it on bread and water, but of his own fancy, to please his own taste, stealing out at nights to find those most interested against us and peaching to them. Do you hear me?" cried the Jew, his eyes flashing with rage. "Suppose he did all this, what then?" "What then?" replied Sykes with a tremendous oath. "If he was left alive till I came, I'd grind his skull under the iron heel of my boot into as many grains as are hairs upon his head. What if I did it? Cried Fagin, almost in a yell. I, that know so much and could hang so many besides myself. I don't know, replied Sykes, clenching his teeth and turning white at the mere suggestion. I'd do something in the jail that'd get me put in irons, and if I was tried along with you, I'd fall upon you with them in the open court and beat your brains out afore the people. I should have such strength, muttered the robber, poising his brawny arm, that I should smash your head as if it was a loaded wagon had gone over it. You would? Would I? Said the housebreaker. Try me. If it was Charlie, or Dodger, or Bet, or I don't care who, replied Sykes impatiently. Whoever it was, I'd serve them the same. Fagin looked hard at the robber, and motioning him to be silent, stooped over the bed upon the floor and shook the sleeper to rouse him. Sykes leant forward in his chair, looking on with his hands upon his knees, as if wondering much what all this questioning and preparation was to end in. Bolter, Bolter, poor lad, said Fagin, looking up with an expression of devilish anticipation and speaking slowly and with marked emphasis. He's tired. Tired with watching for her so long. Watching for her, Bill. What you mean? Asked Sykes, drawing back. Fagin made no answer, but bending over the sleeper again, hauled him into a sitting posture. When his assumed name had been repeated several times, Noah rubbed his eyes and, giving a heavy yawn, looked sleepily about him. Tell him that again, once again, just for him to hear, said the Jew, pointing to Sykes as he spoke. Tell you what? Asked the sleepy Noah, shaking himself pettishly. That about Nancy, said Fagin, clutching Sykes by the wrist, as if to prevent him leaving the house before he'd heard enough. You followed her? Yes. To London Bridge? Yes. Where she met two people? So she did. A gentleman and a lady that she had gone to of her own accord before, who asked her to give up all her pals, and Monks first, which she did, and to describe him, which she did, and to tell her what house it was that we met at and go to, which she did, and where it could be best watched from, which she did, and what time the people went there, which she did. She did all this. She told it all, every word, without threat, without a murmur. She did. Did she not? Cried Fagin, half mad with fury. All right, replied Noah, scratching his head. That's just what it was. What did they say about last Sunday? About last Sunday? Replied Noah, considering. Why, I told you that before. Again, tell it again, cried Fagin, tightening his grasp on Sykes and brandishing his other hand aloft as the foam flew from his lips. They asked her, said Noah, who, as he grew more wakeful, seemed to have a dawning perception who Sykes was. They asked her why she didn't come last Sunday as she promised. She said she couldn't. Why? Tell him that. Because she was forcibly kept at home by Bill, the man she had told him of before, replied Noah. What more of him? Cried Fagin. What more of the man she had told him of before? Tell him that. Why, that she couldn't very easily get out of doors unless he knew where she was going to, said Noah. And so the first time she went to see the lady, she... It made me laugh when she said it, that it did. She gave him a drink of laudanum. Hell's fire! Cried Sykes, breaking fiercely from the Jew. Let me go! Flinging the old man from him, he rushed from the room and darted wildly and furiously up the stairs. Bill! Cried Fagin, following him hastily. A word, only a word. The word would not have been exchanged, but that the housebreaker was unable to open the door, on which he was expending fruitless oaths and violence, when the Jew came panting up. Let me out, said Sykes. Don't speak to me, it's not safe. Let me out, I say. Hear me speak a word, rejoined Fagin, laying his hand upon the lock. You won't be... Well, replied the other, you won't be too violent, Bill. The day was breaking, and there was light enough for the men to see each other's faces. They exchanged one brief glance. There was a fire in the eyes of both, which could not be mistaken. I mean, said Fagin, showing that he felt all disguise was now useless. Not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold. Sykes made no reply, but pulling open the door, of which Fagin had turned the lock, dashed into the silent streets. Without one pause or moment's consideration, without once turning his head to the right or left, or raising his eyes to the sky, or lowering them to the ground, but looking straight before him with savage resolution, his teeth so tightly compressed that his strained jaw seemed starting through his skin, the robber held on his headlong course, nor muttered a word, nor relaxed a muscle until he reached his own door. He opened it softly with a key, strode lightly up the stairs, and entering his own room, double-locked the door, and lifting a heavy table against it, drew back the curtain of the bed. The girl was lying, half-dressed, upon it. He had roused her from her sleep, for she raised herself with a hurried and startled look. "Get up," said the man. "Oh, it is you, Bill," said the girl with an expression of pleasure at his return. "It is," was the reply. "Get up." There was a candle burning, but the man hastily drew it from the candlestick and hurled it into the grate. Seeing the faint light of early day without, the girl rose to undraw the curtain. "Let be," said Sykes, thrusting his hand before her. "There's light enough for what I've got to do." "Bill," said the girl in the low voice of alarm, "why do you look like that at me?" The robber sat regarding her for a few seconds with dilated nostrils and heaving breast, and then, grasping her by the head and throat, dragged her into the middle of the room, and looking once towards the door, placed his heavy hand upon her mouth. "Bill! Bill!" gasped the girl, wrestling with the strength of mortal fear. I won't scream or cry. Not once. Hear me. Speak to me. Tell me what I've done." "You know, you she-devil," returned the robber, suppressing his breath. "You were watched tonight. Every word you said was heard." "Then spare my life for the love of heaven, as I spared yours," rejoined the girl, clinging to him. "Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. Oh, think of all I've given up, only this one night for you. You shall have time to think, and save yourself this crime. I will not lose my old. You cannot throw me off. Bill! Bill! For dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood. I have been true to you. Upon my guilty soul, I have." The man struggled violently to release his arms, but those of the girl were clasped round his, and tear her as he would, he could not tear them away. "Bill!" cried the girl, striving to lay her head upon his breast. "The gentleman and that dear lady told me tonight about home in some foreign country where I could end my days in solitude and peace. Let me see them again and beg them on my knees to show the same mercy and goodness to you. And let us both leave this dreadful place and far apart lead better lives, and forget how we have lived, except in prayers, and never see each other more. It's never too late to repent. They told me so. I feel it now, but we must have time. A little time." The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind, even in the midst of his fury, and he beat it twice, with all the force he could summon, upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead, but raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Maylie's own, and holding it up in her folded hands, as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer of mercy to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon. The murderer, staggering backward to the wall and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. Thank you.
We should probably, that's not working, is it? We should probably have explained that this was the scene that many of his supporters feel killed Dickens. He did public readings across the country of Britain, and he was earlier in the United States, and they would often go on for 3 hours. And he was adamant late in life about reading this scene between, this violent scene between Bill and Nancy. And it just clearly ruined his health to do so, and he wouldn't stop. He died soon after giving his last reading of this scene, of a brain hemorrhage, probably. So that, for all sorts of reasons that still intrigue his critics today, this scene of violence and betrayal and urban crime and brutality was one that he was passionately connected to.